The sound of music and laughter echoed through the valley, carried on the warm summer breeze. Neon lights flickered against the night sky, and the once quiet hills were now glowing like Las Vegas. I stood on the ridge above my land, watching strangers splash in the massive pool, sipping drinks from coconut shells under tiki torches. It wasn't just a party, it was a full-blown resort. On my land. A banner reading, "Grand Opening," hung proudly over the main entrance, and cars lined the newly paved road, packed so tightly that dust still swirled around their tires. People cheered as a band played on the deck, and servers in crisp uniforms carried trays of food I didn't recognize. My land had turned into some kind of tropical paradise, without my permission. But what they didn't know, what no one in that HOA suspected, was that I had been waiting for this exact moment. The bulldozers, the concrete mixers, the fancy landscaping. I had let it all happen. Every nail hammered, every light strung, every dollar they poured into this place was part of my plan. I took one last look at the resort below, then reached into my pocket, feeling the smooth edges of a small leather-bound folder. Inside were the papers that would change everything. Papers they didn't know existed. My lips curled into the smallest smile as I whispered to myself, they just walked right into it. And that's when I saw her, Linda Monroe, the HOA president, stepping onto the balcony with a champagne glass in hand, giving a toast to the crowd. The same woman who, just months ago, had stood in my driveway and called my family's farm an eyesore. I watched her laugh, the sound traveling up the hill like nails on a chalkboard. She had no idea she was celebrating her own downfall. But before I could enjoy the moment, something unexpected caught my eye. A flash of red lights in the distance, and they were coming fast. Months earlier, before this circus on my land ever began, things were quiet. I'd been living on my 15-acre property for years, raising chickens, tending to my small orchard, and fixing up the old farmhouse my grandfather built. Life was peaceful, and I intended to keep it that way. That's when the HOA moved in. Not onto my property, they didn't own a single square inch of it, but to the new gated neighborhood that popped up next door. The houses were massive, the driveways spotless, and the lawns unnaturally green. The kind of place where people complained if you put the wrong color flowers in your garden. At first, I thought they'd leave me alone. I wasn't in their HOA, and my land wasn't part of their jurisdiction. But I underestimated them. The first, friendly letter arrived in my mailbox a week later. It wasn't actually friendly, it was a list of suggestions for how I could improve my property's appearance. They wanted me to paint the farmhouse white, replace my split-rail fence with something more modern, and, my personal favorite, relocate my rooster because he was too loud for the neighborhood aesthetic. I ignored them. Then came the visits. Linda Monroe herself started showing up at my gate with that fake smile plastered on her face. She'd say things like, "We're just trying to help you fit in with the community," or "This could be such a valuable piece of land if you made the right changes." I'd always answer politely, but firmly. Not interested. One afternoon, though, Linda's tone changed. She hinted that they had big plans for the area, plans that would benefit everyone. I should have known right then she meant trouble. The plans started to show themselves 2 months later. Surveyors began walking the edges of my property, snapping photos and marking the ground with orange spray paint. When I confronted them, they claimed they were just checking property lines for the HOA's records. I didn't believe it for a second. That was the low point, the moment I realized they weren't going to stop. But instead of losing my temper, I decided to play along. If they thought they could outsmart me, I'd let them think it. And while they worked on their plans, I started working on mine. The first extreme move they made was bold, almost laughably bold. One morning, I woke up to the sound of engines. I stepped outside and saw bulldozers and trucks rolling across my pasture, tearing up the grass and digging trenches. I tried to stop them, but the workers waved me off, saying they had authorization from the HOA. They didn't. When I went to confront Linda, she didn't even try to deny it. "This is going to be something special," she said with that same smug smile. "And when it's done, you'll thank us." She didn't know it, but that was the moment I decided to let them build it. Let them pour their money, their time, and their reputation into my land. And when the time was right, I'd pull the rug out from under them. Weeks turned into months, and construction went full speed ahead. My peaceful fields transformed into a buzzing construction zone, pools, guest suites, tennis courts, a spa, even a small concert stage. It was insane. The HOA threw event after event to show off progress, and the neighborhood ate it up. But while they were busy building their dream resort, I was busy collecting something much more valuable, evidence. And that's when we circle back to tonight. The lights, the music, the champagne, and those flashing red lights getting closer. I didn't know it yet, but whatever was coming down that road was about to change the entire game. And I wasn't sure if it was part of my plan, or something completely out of my control. The red lights grew brighter, flickering against the rows of parked cars as they snaked their way up the hill. At first, I thought it might just be an ambulance or a fire truck passing through, but then I heard the low rumble of multiple engines. It wasn't one vehicle, it was several. From my vantage point above the resort, I could see people below turning their heads, craning their necks toward the road. The music kept playing, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Even Linda lowered her champagne glass for a second, squinting toward the flashing lights. The convoy rolled into view, 2 sheriff's cruisers, a flatbed truck, and a county code enforcement van. I could almost feel the ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The sheriff's cars slowed, their headlights washing over the brand-new entrance sign, the tiki torches, the grinning security guards who clearly didn't know what to do. I stayed put on the ridge, my leather folder still in my pocket, letting the scene unfold without me. This wasn't my moment, not yet. But it was coming. And as the sheriff stepped out of their vehicles, their boots crunching on the fresh gravel, I couldn't help but remember the last time something like this had happened on my land, back before the resort even existed. It was early spring then, one of those crisp mornings where the air smells like wet soil and blooming flowers. I'd been mending the chicken coop fence when I heard the roar of engines. I rushed to the front gate just in time to see 3 construction trucks pull up, followed by a man in a suit stepping out of a shiny black SUV. He introduced himself as project manager for the HOA's Community Enhancement Initiative. I told him plainly, "This isn't your land." He smiled like I'd just told a joke and handed me a clipboard with a bunch of papers. None of them had my signature on them. None of them meant anything legally. I told him to leave. He didn't. Instead, he gestured to his crew, and within minutes, they started unloading equipment. Survey stakes, concrete forms, even portable toilets. That was the first time I saw the scope of what they were trying to do. They weren't just making improvements. They were planning something massive. I had a choice right then: call the sheriff and shut it down immediately, or let them dig themselves deeper. I chose the latter. The days that followed were almost surreal. They cleared a huge section of my orchard, cut down old apple trees that had been there since my grandfather's time, and started laying foundations. Linda came by often, dressed in bright pastel blouses and gold jewelry, telling workers where to put the cabana and the water feature. I stayed quiet, except for polite comments that made it sound like I was tolerating them. What they didn't realize was that every time they poured another yard of concrete or installed another luxury amenity, they were adding to my future payday. I kept all the documentation. Drone photos, receipts I accidentally saw, overheard conversations that I jotted down. Still, there were moments that tested my patience. One day, a worker accidentally drove a forklift into my barn wall, crushing an entire section. Instead of apologizing, Linda told me the barn was old anyway, and that maybe I could build something more fitting for the new image of the area. That night, sitting on my porch, I almost called it all off. Almost. But then I remembered, sometimes the best revenge isn't fast. It's patient. And now, patience had brought me here. Back at the resort's grand opening, the sheriffs were moving through the crowd, speaking to the event staff. The music cut out abruptly, replaced by an uneasy murmur. Linda descended the steps from the balcony, her confident strut slower than usual. From my ridge, I watched her greet the lead deputy, shaking his hand with that same too-bright smile. But her body language was different, stiffer, sharper. I couldn't hear their words, but I could guess the conversation. Then, without warning, the flatbed truck's rear gate slammed open, echoing across the valley. And what they started unloading onto the gravel made my jaw tighten. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't part of my plan at all. The men on the flatbed began unloading giant, weather-beaten metal signs, each one streaked with rust but still legible under the glare of the headlights. From my distance, I could just make out the faded black lettering: private property, no trespassing, county enforcement. I froze. Those weren't new signs. Those were my old signs. The ones my grandfather had put up decades ago along the fence line, before the HOA houses even existed. Signs that had mysteriously disappeared months ago when the surveying started. Now, they were back, and the sheriffs weren't holding them. It was the county enforcement officers hauling them off the truck and stacking them in a neat pile by the entrance. I didn't like that. It meant someone, somewhere, had been digging into old records, and they'd found proof this land had been marked as private long before the HOA ever existed. Linda must have seen the pile too because her face twitched for the first time that night. Just a little, a tiny crack in the perfect facade. She said something sharply to the lead deputy, gesturing toward the crowd like she could somehow wave away the problem. But the deputy didn't move. Instead, the county officer opened a thick binder and held it up so Linda could see. From my spot on the ridge, I could see the clear plastic sleeves holding yellowed documents, deeds, maps, and what looked like a handwritten letter in my grandfather's cursive. The resort guests didn't know what was happening yet. Most of them thought it was some kind of surprise inspection, maybe even part of the event. I heard laughter carry faintly through the night air as people went back to sipping their cocktails. But Linda's posture told a different story, her shoulders drawn up, her head tilted in sharp disbelief, like she was reading something she didn't want to admit was real. Watching her, my mind drifted back to the day I found those original papers myself. It was just after the orchard had been bulldozed. I'd gone up to the attic of the old farmhouse, looking for my grandfather's box of photographs, when I found a locked tin container tucked behind the rafters. Inside were those documents, his original deed, the survey maps from the county, and a written statement about the land's legal boundaries. That was the day my plan truly took shape. Not only did I own every inch of the property they were building on, but my grandfather had taken steps to make sure it could never be sold, rezoned, or taken without explicit family consent. The kind of legal safety net most people didn't even know existed. I didn't show those papers to anyone. Not then. I tucked them away, knowing they'd be my ace in the hole when the time was right. But seeing them now, out in the open, in the hands of county officials, wasn't part of my script. Back at the resort, Linda's confident smile was completely gone. She turned away from the binder and called for someone, probably one of her board members. But before they could respond, the lead deputy held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. He gestured toward the front gates, where the county officers were now chaining the private property signs back onto the fence posts. And that's when the first ripple of confusion hit the guests. A man in a Hawaiian shirt asked loudly if they were shutting the place down. A woman in a glittering dress clutched her purse tighter, glancing nervously at the parked sheriff's cars. The deputy leaned in and said something to Linda that made her eyes widen, and for a second, she glanced up toward the ridge, toward me. It was time to move. I started walking down the slope, slow and steady, my boots crunching over the dry grass. Every step brought me closer to the glowing lights, the thump of bass music trying to start up again, and the tightening knot of tension at the resort entrance. By the time I reached the edge of the crowd, I could feel the shift in the air. The laughter was gone. Conversations were hushed. Even the band had stopped pretending to play. And then the deputy's voice cut through the quiet. "Ma'am," he said to Linda, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "you don't own this land." The silence that followed was so sharp it almost hurt. And before Linda could answer, another voice from behind me shouted something that made my stomach drop. It was a voice I knew. A voice that should not have been here tonight. "Jacob. What in the hell is going on here?" The voice came from behind me, deep and sharp enough to slice through the crowd's murmurs. My chest tightened instantly. I turned just enough to see the tall figure striding toward the entrance, broad shoulders, a weathered face, and eyes that could still cut me in half after all these years. It was my Uncle Raymond. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. The last time we'd spoken was at my father's funeral, and it hadn't ended on good terms. He'd stormed out of the service after accusing me of trying to play big man by taking over the farm. I thought he'd moved clear across the country. Yet here he was, walking straight toward the heart of my trap like he owned the place. Linda turned at the sound of his voice, her expression snapping back into a version of her confident mask. "Raymond. I'm so glad you could make it. Maybe you can help us clear up this misunderstanding." I froze. The way she said his name, it wasn't just recognition. She knew him. Raymond didn't even glance at her at first. He marched right up to me, stopping so close I could smell the faint mix of aftershave and dust on his jacket. "You didn't tell me they were doing all this on the property," he said, low but with that dangerous edge he always carried. "I had to hear it from one of Linda's board members last week." My jaw tightened. "It's my land, Ray." His eyes narrowed. "That's where you're wrong. It's ours. Always has been. You think Grandpa's will was just a nice story? He left it to both of us, Jacob." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of the guests had stopped pretending not to eavesdrop. Linda's smile widened slightly, like a fox sensing the henhouse door was ajar. I'd known for years that Raymond technically had his name on the inheritance papers, but he'd disappeared long before my father passed. Never called, never wrote, never showed any interest in the farm. I'd taken care of the land, paid the taxes, and kept it afloat when times got hard. As far as I was concerned, his name on paper meant nothing. But the timing of his sudden reappearance was no accident. I looked at Linda, and the truth clicked into place. She'd brought him here. It explained the boldness, the unshakable confidence in building the resort. They'd been betting on the fact that Raymond could be their key, someone who could claim partial ownership and back them up legally. If that happened, my entire plan could crumble before it even hit the ground. The deputy stepped between us before the argument could explode. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "let's keep this civil. We're here because the county received a complaint about unauthorized construction on private property. We're verifying ownership before taking any enforcement action." Linda jumped in like she'd been waiting for that opening. "Exactly. Which is why I'm glad Mr. Raymond is here. He can confirm we had his blessing from the start." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. The trap I'd set was still there, still ready, but now there was a wild card standing in the middle of it, threatening to snap it in half. Raymond didn't answer her right away. Instead, he turned to me, his voice calm but full of something colder. "Tell me, Jacob, before you start waving your little folder of papers around, did you ever once think to call me? To ask if I wanted a say?" The truth was, I hadn't. And admitting that in front of Linda, the deputies, and half the county wasn't an option. So I took a step closer, lowered my voice so only he could hear, and said, "If you side with them, you're going to regret it." He smirked, just barely, and that was when I knew. He wasn't here to help me. He was here to play his own game. Before I could respond, one of the county officers came running up from the parking area, holding something high in the air. A folder. Not mine, thicker, older, and stuffed with papers that looked just as yellowed as the ones in my pocket. "We found this in the office trailer," the officer said, slightly breathless. "And you're all gonna want to see what's inside." The officer handed the folder to the lead deputy, who flipped it open right there under the floodlights. Pages rustled as he scanned the contents, his brow furrowing deeper with every sheet he turned. Linda stood tall, her hands clasped like she was seconds away from claiming victory. Raymond crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on me as if he already knew what was inside. The deputy finally looked up. "This," he said slowly, "is a signed lease agreement." My stomach tightened. "A lease?" I asked, keeping my voice calm even though the muscles in my jaw were straining. "Yup," the deputy replied, holding the page higher so the county officer beside him could confirm. "According to this, Mr. Raymond leased a portion of this property, roughly 6 acres, to the HOA for commercial development. This document's dated 9 months ago." I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Guests. Deputies. HOA board members. Even the caterers had stopped serving drinks. Linda's grin turned sharp. "Which means, Jacob, that this resort is perfectly legal." "Not exactly," the county officer interjected, flipping to another page. "This lease was never filed with the county clerk. And more importantly, the description of the leased land overlaps with parcels that, according to our records, cannot be divided or altered without unanimous consent of all legal owners." Her smile faltered. The officer tapped the page with one finger. "Which means even if this lease is real, it's invalid unless both of you signed it." He looked between me and Raymond. "Did you sign, sir?" I shook my head. "Not even close." The murmur from the crowd deepened, now flavored with disbelief and whispers. Linda's voice pitched higher. "This is ridiculous. We've been working with Mr. Raymond for months, he assured us there wouldn't be any legal issues." Raymond didn't flinch. "And I told you," he said evenly, "Jacob and I would handle it between us. I didn't promise you the land. I promised you a chance." That was the moment I realized just how deep his game ran. He'd never been on her side completely. He'd been stringing her along, maybe for money, maybe for leverage over me, maybe just for the satisfaction of seeing us both squirm. But while they were busy throwing words at each other, my focus snapped back to the deputy's hands. In that folder, tucked between the lease papers, was something else. Something I recognized instantly, an old aerial photograph of the property from before I was even born. And on the back, my grandfather's handwritten note outlining the exact location of the original boundary stakes. The stakes I'd found last winter, buried under years of dirt and brush, when I started quietly marking the limits of the land again. I could feel the tide shifting back toward me. "Deputy," I said, stepping forward, "I have documents at home that match those records exactly. And they prove beyond any doubt that not only is this land still intact under one title, but it's protected under a covenant my grandfather filed in 1974. Raymond's expression finally cracked, just a little. Linda went pale. The deputy closed the folder and nodded. "Then I suggest we all head to the county office first thing in the morning to verify these claims. Until then," he glanced at the county officer. "Until then," the officer said, "this property is under immediate construction freeze. No operations, no events, no guests staying overnight." The groan from the crowd was almost comical, rich vacationers realizing their getaway had just ended before it began. Staff started whispering in frantic tones. The tiki torches flickered in the sudden, tense quiet. Linda's voice cut through it like broken glass. "You're going to pay for this, Jacob." I didn't bother looking at her. My eyes were on Raymond. Because while Linda's threat was loud and obvious, his was silent, buried under that slight smirk and the glint in his eyes. And sure enough, he stepped closer, just enough so only I could hear him. "You think you've won tonight," he murmured, "but you don't even see the real move yet." Before I could ask what he meant, the sound of engines roared from the far side of the property, heavy, powerful engines moving fast. And every instinct in me knew whatever was coming next wasn't part of anyone's plan. The engines grew louder, their deep, mechanical growl cutting through the night like a warning bell. Heads turned toward the far side of the property, where the darkness swallowed the tree line. Then, out of the shadows, they appeared, 3 massive flatbed trucks with industrial floodlights mounted on their roofs, blinding in their intensity. Behind them, in a slow, menacing crawl, came a convoy of heavy equipment, excavators, dozers, and something that looked like a giant steel claw. The crowd gasped. Even the deputies froze. The lead truck braked hard, its air brakes hissing like a snake, and a man in a hard hat and reflective vest jumped down. He carried a clipboard, but his posture said this wasn't a casual inspection. "Who's in charge here?" he shouted over the idling roar of machinery. Linda stepped forward instantly, her voice sharp and indignant. "I am. This is a private event." "Not anymore, it isn't," the man cut her off, holding up a thick packet of papers. "I'm with the county reclamation department. And as of 10 minutes ago, this land has been ordered cleared." A wave of disbelief rolled through the crowd. Linda laughed, but it was the brittle laugh of someone who had just been shoved toward a cliff. "Cleared? You can't just." "Yes, ma'am, we can," he said, flipping to the top page. "Per Title 14, Section 332 of County Code, any unauthorized commercial structure built without permits, on land under legal dispute, can be immediately dismantled. And since the rightful owner," he glanced at me, "filed an emergency enforcement request earlier this evening, we're here to execute." The words hit like a thunderclap. Heads whipped toward me, mouths falling open. Raymond's smirk vanished completely. Linda's face flushed red. "This is insane. You can't just tear down a multi-million-dollar project in one night." The man didn't even blink. "Watch us." On his signal, the excavators roared to life, their massive arms swinging toward the pristine resort structures. The steel claw descended onto the brand-new cabana, splintering its polished wood like it was matchsticks. Glass shattered as a poolside bar went down in a crash of steel and debris. Guests screamed and scrambled for the parking lot, their glittering dresses and tailored suits illuminated by the harsh glare of floodlights. Some tried to grab their drinks or beach bags, only to be pushed along by deputies directing them toward the exit. Linda ran toward the lead excavator, waving her arms, but a county officer stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, step back. This is an active demolition zone." Raymond turned to me, his voice low and furious. "You set this up. You knew they'd come." I met his glare with a steady stare. "I told you, if you sided with them, you'd regret it." The machines moved fast, tearing through months of construction in minutes. The stage where the band had played just an hour ago collapsed under the bite of a dozer's blade. The spa's glass walls caved in with a crash, water from a shattered hot tub spilling across the gravel. But I wasn't just watching. I was walking, slowly, deliberately, toward the center of the chaos. I pulled the leather folder from my pocket and opened it, letting the floodlight catch the crisp, notarized documents inside. The reclamation officer spotted me and gave a small nod. "Mr. Jacobs, everything's proceeding as authorized." Linda heard that. Her voice rose in a near scream. "You did this?" I looked at her, at the rubble behind her, and said clearly enough for everyone still lingering to hear, "You built a resort on my land without asking. I let you. And now you're paying for every single brick you stole." The final blow came when the excavator swung its claw into the centerpiece of the resort, the massive infinity pool. The concrete cracked in a deafening boom, and a tidal wave of water surged downhill, washing over the fancy imported landscaping and flooding the entrance road. Cars honked in panic as the wave hit them, forcing guests to jump onto the embankments to keep from getting soaked. By the time the machinery stopped, nothing was left but broken wood, twisted metal, and shattered glass glittering in the floodlights. Linda stood frozen, her heels sinking slightly into the mud, her perfect hair ruined by the spray. Raymond had already turned and walked away without a word. The deputy approached me. "Guess this chapter's closed, huh?" I closed the folder and slipped it back into my jacket. "No," I said, watching Linda glare at the wreckage like she could will it back together. "This chapter's done." "But the book?" "I'm just getting started." Because I knew something she didn't, the county's demolition costs were about to be billed directly to the HOA. And Linda? She had signed every authorization form herself. As I walked back up the ridge, the sound of engines idling behind me, I let myself smile. They thought they were building a paradise. I'd been building a trap. And they never even saw it coming.